Alice in Borderland Season 3 has landed on our screens, and with its return, it brought the arrival of 9 brand new games that featured in this world that exists between life and death. From real intimate games and ones that showed a player's potential future if they walked through the correct door, to ones where players would have to use their brains or else they'd face 100 million arrows that were on fire being thrown their way. I think some of these games were the best that the show's created. So with that, I wanted to explain every new game that featured in this new installment of the show. Here is Alice in Borderland Season 3, Every Game Explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. Game 1, Old Maid. The first game was played by Ryuji, and there were a total of 7 people sat around a circular table, all sat on chairs that were connected to a power supply where if you lost a round you'd be shocked. Players would draw cards, and whoever was holding onto the Joker was the Old Maid, and if you had the Joker card at the end of the game, then you'd be the winner. However, if you took the Joker card from somebody, the person that was originally holding it would be eliminated. As well as that, if you move from the chair after the game has started, a player would be eliminated as well. Plus, if you pull a pair and end up matching the same suit in your hand, then you end up being eliminated too. This is something that continues on until there are only 2 players left, and it ultimately concludes by the victor being the person that has the Joker left in their hand. When it comes to the difficulty level, this is one that's essentially all down to luck. There's no skill involved whatsoever unless you're able to manipulate the opponent to be able to pick a card in your hand that you want them to pick. In terms of the death, whilst it's pretty gruesome and it looked horrific, it was one that was pretty quick. It's more the fear and the build up to the death that would get inside of a player's mind. Game 2, Sacred Fortunes. This was a game that I quite liked. It had an element of luck to it, but it also required the contestants to use their brain in order to solve the problems that were in front of them, and to also find a good hiding spot. Players would draw a number, and the number would correlate to a fortune that was inside of a box. On each fortune, there was a question that would need solving, and it would be a numbers answer. If the player guessed the answer correctly, then there'd be no consequence. However, if the player guessed the number incorrectly, then the difference in numbers would end up firing their way in the form of arrows. For example, one of the questions was around how many litres of cow's blood was needed to make 1 litre of milk. Somebody guessed 2 litres, but the actual answer was 450 litres, so that meant that 448 arrows were fired their way. This was something that would go on until players were eliminated. With the final question causing 100 million arrows to be headed towards them, Arisu worked out that the only way to avoid the arrows was to look for the safe haven underground, and that's how the surviving players made it out of there. In terms of difficulty, this was a very difficult one because some of those answers were set up for failure. And the avoiding of the arrows was again something that was just down to being lucky in the spot that a player found. Game 3, Zombie Hunt. This was one of the most interesting games in the show. It was a game where a player would have 7 cards each, and a player would use the cards to play one-on-one games at different desks. Whichever player had the highest number out of the cards that they played with would win a round, and if a player won the round, then they'd take the opponent's card. Alongside this, there were 3 special cards. The zombie card, which would infect somebody if they weren't a zombie, and it would trump every other card, providing an instant win. The loser player would then also get a zombie card, and they can infect other players too. Alongside this, there was the shotgun card, which was able to kill a zombie and would eliminate a player, and there was also a vaccine card, which could revive a zombie and bring them back to the side of the human. The aim of this game was to either decide if the people were going to become zombies or humans, and whichever side had more members by the end of the final round, then they'd win, and the losing side would be eliminated. This was a game that was played with other teams participating inside of the Borderlands as well, so it wasn't just the original group that were within it. In terms of difficulty, I'd say this one is relatively easy. Most people could have just said, let's become a zombie, and then they all would have survived. When it came to the deaths, again, they were pretty instant, with the laser being the thing that caused the players to become eliminated. Game 4, Floating Lasers. Now, this was a game that we didn't really get that much of an insight into, as it was the first time that we saw Usagi and Ryuji in the games, and we were introduced to it partway through. But by the short feature that we had, it seemed like the players had to essentially jump over, duck below, and hide from these laser beams that would come flying towards them. Then, once they passed the time frame or made it to the end of the track, then they'd have completed the game. In terms of difficulty, I actually think this one looked like one of the more difficult ones to do. This is because the lasers were moving fast, they were coming in at different angles, and the timing of this would have needed to have been perfect. Game 5, Runaway Train. This was one of the most interesting games in the season, and it was purely all down to luck. Players would start at the back of an 8-cart train that didn't have a driver, and they'd need to make their way through the carts, and at each cart they'd be met with a decision to either put on a gas mask with a canister that would protect them from poison gas, or to not do that. This is because 4 of the carts would emit a poisoned gas that would eliminate the players. Players would have 5 canisters, which would allow for one wrong decision, and they also weren't allowed to use other players' canisters, so if they ran out, they'd simply die. A canary was placed in the center of the cart to show whether it was oxygen that was being pushed through or the poisoned gas. If the bird died and the players put their mask on, then it showed that they made the right decision. However, if it didn't die and they put their mask on, then it showed that they wasted a canister. Once the surviving players made it to the front of the train, then they'd need to stop it before it reached the end of the line. In terms of difficulty, this was probably one of the most difficult games because it relied solely on luck and gut instinct. There was no predictability to it, and the way to survive was to just guess correctly. When it came to the deaths in this game, this was probably one of the worst. The gas would slowly kill the player, and it was almost like they were suffocating and drowning at the same time. It was a horrific one for sure. Game 6, Tokyo Bingo Tower. This was a game that was considered to be a semi-final for Usagi's group. The players had a bingo card that needed to be completed, and in order to complete it, players would need to climb the tower and press the buzzers that correlated to the numbers on the card. They had to do a vertical, horizontal, or diagonal line to complete the game. Then, at the top of the tower, there was a button which represented the center of the card which needed to be pressed. The risks in this game were obviously needing the ability to climb and falling if you didn't have the energy or skills. Plus, there were also these balls that dropped from the sky that were knocking players off, causing them to lose balance and making them fall to their death. All players that survived were then able to progress onto the final game. This was a very difficult game. Not only did you need good physical strength and balance, but a player would also need to not be put off by the heights. As well as that, they'd also need to be able to avoid the balls that were falling from the sky, so it was a real mental and physical game. Game 7, Kick the Can. Kick the Can was the semi-final that Arisu had to go through, and whilst it was difficult, I don't think it was as difficult as Tokyo Bingo Tower. Within this game, a player would kick a can, and from there it would activate the power within it and it would go flying around before ultimately landing on a different floor. Once it landed, players would then need to rush to get the can and return it to its starting point in the center of the ground. When the player would pick up the can, it would start a timer. However, every time the can changed hands, the timer would decrease by 5 seconds. If the timer ran out before it was placed in the ground, the can would basically explode and kill those that were around it. As well as that, if the can took impact, then it would also explode too. There were 10 rounds in this game, and once a player returned the can and progressed on to the next round, they'd then need to stand in the elevator and watch it continue. There were other ways to be eliminated in this game as well, such as going into areas that were prohibited, like the closed-off escalators. This was a relatively difficult game because not only did you have to find the can, but you also needed to then make your way back to the center whilst fending off all of the other players that wanted to take you out before the timer ran out. Game 8, Possible Futures. This was arguably the most complex, but also the most interesting game that was in the show. There were 25 different rooms that the players had the option of going into. They could only go through the doors that were on the sides of the room, and the players would roll the dice, and the numbers on the dice would dictate how many people could advance into that room. If players couldn't advance, then they'd be stuck in isolation in that room where their worst nightmares would play to them, and the only way that they'd be able to get out would be if players were in rooms either side of them. A player would start the game with 15 points, and there'd be a cost to each room that players would progress into. The whole point of this game was to walk through the doors and find the exit that we later found lying beyond the door A5. If a player's points reached 0 before they found the exit because they took a route that didn't allow them to find it, then they'd be eliminated due to the collar that they were wearing. On each of the walls behind the doors there were images which showed different futures for the players, some which brought success and others which showed a lifetime of misery. The ones with success would often bring the players further away from the exit, and the ones that had misery meant that they had to suffer through short-term difficulties in order to get that freedom. In the final room where the exit was, players had to roll a dice to decide the amount of people that would be able to leave. With this being a Joker game, all but one was allowed to leave. However, it was actually the one person that was left inside of the room that was able to get the freedom, not everybody that left, meaning that it was all just one big joke and the card was pulled. This was probably the game that brought the most emotional moments, and it was the most complex one that required the most thought too. It was also the longest game of them all. Game 9. Pick a card. This was kind of like a bonus game that featured when Arisu met the Watchmen. Within this game, an entire deck of cards was laid out in front of Arisu, and 2 cards were selected. One was supposed to be the Joker, and the other was one of a different value. If Arisu pulled the Joker, then it meant that the Watchman would decide his destiny. But if Arisu avoided the Joker card, then it meant that he'd avoid that decision. The game was rigged, as it probably always is for the Watchman, because there were 2 Joker cards that were lying on the table. This is because it's the job that the Watchman has, to decide people's destiny. So it's a game that one can never truly win if they play properly. So that final game then marked the end of the 9 that we were given in this season of the show. Personally, I thought it was a solid selection of games. The visuals were great, the tension was high, and the deaths that we saw were absolutely brutal. So, there you have it. Alice in Borderland Season 3, Every Game Explained.